Hi there. Obviously, we're having a little trouble with Lirzan's audio feed. We'll go back to her in a moment, hopefully. So I'm going to do my part of the introduction. And our speaker today has been at MIT since 1993. And in 2019, he was named Institute Professor. That is the highest accolade, the highest faculty honor one can achieve at MIT. He's recognized as one of the most influential thinkers of our time, and that's due to the incredible depth and breadth of his scholarship. Over 170 scholarly articles, and that doesn't even include the many chapters in books. Often, Darren collaborates, and that's testimony to his popularity and respect of his peers. He's received more than 40 prizes, honors, or awards, and of those, I just want to highlight one of them, and that's the John Bates Clark Medal, which he received in 2005. And that honors the most influential, most significant contributions by an economist under the age of 40. Previous winners of the Clark Medal include Paul Samuelson, Milton Friedman, Joseph Stiglitz. So he is in very good company. Darren is an elected fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, just to name a few. He's the author or co-author of 6 books, including the critically acclaimed the New York Times bestseller, Why Nations Fail. While some writers stay in one area of expertise, Darren comfortably moves between political economy, economic development, technological change, inequality, labor economics, and the economics of networks. So Darren will have some prepared remarks and then answer questions from you, the audience. And now, before we go and network with our good friend, Professor Darren Acemoglu, Lirzan, are you back for a little more of the intro?
Thank you so much. As Professor Acemoglu, along with Simon Johnson, eloquently argues in their book Power and Progress, this trajectory is not set in stone. And their work underscores the crucial role of the choices and policies in steering technological innovation towards broader empowerment and democratization. This book is a clarion call to redirect innovation to serve the many and not just the few. So, as we engage in today's discussion, let us be inspired by the vision set forth by Darren Acemoglu and explore how we can harness technology as a catalyst for inclusive progress and prosperity. I'm also delighted to let you know that the first 100 guests will receive a complimentary electronic copy of the book, courtesy of the Fordham Gabelli Center for Global Security Analysis. Thank you once again for your presence and participation today, and I'm looking forward to the enlightening discussion and insights that are going to emerge from this forum. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Larzan. Thank you, David, for this very nice and flattering introduction. It's my true pleasure to be here, and it's my real honor to be collaborating with Fordham University again. I've had that pleasure before, but this is a different part of the school, and it's really great that you have decided to invite me to talk about my book, which I am delighted to do. And let me just say a few words about uh, oops, uh, why Simon and I wrote the book. We were motivated to bring a more critical perspective to the clearly transformative issues of what new digital technologies and artificial intelligence will do to work, to democracy, to inequality, away from the rather sort of simplistic pessimism and optimism scenarios that we often hear about in the media. There is a very deep undercurrent of techno optimism in US society and sometimes among policymakers and academics as well. But that's also not nicely counterbalanced by the very pessimistic scenarios that are sometimes emphasized, for example, stressing how AI could lead to the end of humanity or other types of far-fetched outcomes. We think that there are very important questions about how to use technology, the direction of technological change, and the institutional framework in which technologies are embedded. And I'm going to start by talking about what it is that we typically expect from technologies, what we have sometimes achieved from technological change, and why those issues are actually not a foregone conclusion. Part of the reason why economists are uh, often quite optimistic about technology is that we think that technological progress in the past has contributed to shared prosperity, meaning prosperity that has lifted uh, the great majority of the people out of poverty into higher wages, into middle class status. And this is just a generally held belief, sometimes supported by history and evidence, but at its root is a set of economic forces which are uh, often argued in economic discussions but don't even have a name. So Simon and I called it the productivity bandwagon. And it goes something like this: technology improves, this increases productivity, meaning how much firms produce with a given amount of resources, including labor and capital. And then as productivity increases, there are a set of market processes that lead the uh, to the improvement of living standards of workers. So in particular, wages increase, and this improves the take-home pay of workers. And in fact, you can see that it's going to be very difficult to maintain anything approaching shared prosperity if somehow the labor market did not transmit the increase in productivity to worker incomes. But what's the mechanism for this productivity bandwagon? Well, if you think about it, there are really two sets of ideas here that are really important. One is that as productivity rises, firms have a desire to go out and demand more labor so that this raises the demand for workers, and as a result, it puts upward pressure on wages. And second, the market process works so that these wages are going to, in fact, increase in the face of greater demand. And when you look at history, it's actually a more nuanced picture that emerges. It is true that there are periods in history, and I'll talk about some of them, where the productivity bandwagon did operate, but there are many other periods in which it didn't. And the reason why you can see the productivity bandwagon get stuck is really related to these two presumptions that I have already summarized. Either productivity rises don't trigger an increase in labor demand, or even if there is a desire on the side of firms to want more effort and more labor from workers, they don't have to pay higher wages. So the second is where I'm going to start because it relates to the institutional basis of power and how labor markets and the economy are broadly organized. And here I'm showing two very transformative technologies from history: the windmills from the medieval period, which completely revolutionized several sectors of the economy. On the right, the cotton gin, which enabled the growing of the southern type of cotton in the US South and turned the US South from an economic backwater to one of the most uh, fast growing parts of the world economy, the biggest exporter of cotton in the early 19th century. And in both cases, huge fortunes were made, but there was nothing approaching shared prosperity. And to understand why that was the case is quite easy, because these technologies were embedded in a power structure that provided no counterbalance to the command of a very small elite. In the case of the medieval windmills, it was the nobility and the top clergy that controlled the windmills, and they coerced people to use them. They destroyed alternatives to the windmills, and there was nothing approaching competition in the labor market. So the living standards of farmers and farm workers did not improve. On the right, when you look at the cotton gin, you should think of the black enslaved population, which were the bulk of the labor force that produced cotton and was the heart of the southern economy. But of course, as slavery always means. There was a very big imbalance of power. So the black workers actually ended up working under harsher conditions, longer hours, and did not experience any of the gains of economic growth that the Southern economy itself enjoyed. Now, but even more fundamental is the question of whether an increase in productivity necessarily leads to a desire on the side of firms to hire more labor. And for that, perhaps we can turn to the Industrial Revolution, which is the origin story of a lot of the many good things that have happened in our economy over the last 100 or so years. But also, it's this often misinterpreted episode in history. The Industrial Revolution, starting sometime in 1750, is indeed responsible for the fact that we are so much more comfortable, healthier, and prosperous than people who lived 250 years ago. But the first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution were horrible. Part of it, again, was because of the institutional reasons. Again, Britain was a very unbalanced society, a small minority controlled political power, and there was suppression of all sorts of democratic demands and worker organization. And we also see that this institutional structure became even harsher during the first decades of the Industrial Revolution. But even more important in the case of the British experience is that early technologies focused on automation, meaning substituting machines for the tasks previously performed by labor. There's nothing wrong with automation, but if technology just focuses on automation, this link between higher productivity and higher wages gets broken down. And this is exactly what happened in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. Productivity increased, a number of people made tremendous fortunes, but real wages declined, real incomes stagnated, working conditions got much worse, and working hours expanded. That's because skilled artisans were replaced by cheaper labor, monitored and put to work in factories. What's going on here is a much more general phenomenon. The idea that when productivity increases, firms are going to rush out and try to buy more labor is not really supported by economic theory or historical evidence. It really depends on why productivity is increasing. Indeed, that's exactly what would happen if we made workers more productive, if we provided them with tools to perform their tasks better and provided new tasks for them. But when automation is the main force of technology, what's going on is that you're sidelining labor, and that sidelining does not necessarily lead to better outcomes. And this was, of course, embedded in a social system where the modern factory was very much repressive. This is when Jeremy Bentham thought of the panopticon as a great way of organizing factories, hospitals, and prisons. But of course, it's not great for the workers themselves who were being treated very harshly, and the overall living conditions got much worse. Life expectancy may have fallen to as low as 30 in British cities because of endemic pollution and uncontrolled epidemics. Modern times are different. This is all history, and history is useful for us to understand what's going on, but it's also important to recognize in what ways we are different from the history. And these charts where I am showing the cumulative real wage changes for 10 demographic groups, distinguished by gender and education group categories, shows both the bright and the not so bright parts of why the modern times are different. We don't live in a British Industrial Revolution type society in which workers have no voice and no rights, but the patterns of how shared economic growth has been is much more nuanced. So what you see, for example, starting from 1963 in this graph, but the same pattern continues from other data sets, or the same pattern is visible from other data sets if you go back to the 1950s as well. The early parts of the post-war era in the United States and in many other industrialized nations was one of shared prosperity. One way you can see that is by looking at the fact that these 5 curves here on each side of the graph referring to the real incomes or real wages of workers with different levels of education, starting from workers without a high school degree in orange, those with just a high school degree in green, all the way up to the dark blue, which is workers with postgraduate degrees, you see that in the 1960s and 1950s, these curves are on top of each other. This is the pattern of shared prosperity that I was referring to. Real wages of all demographic groups are growing more or less in tandem. Everybody is broadly benefiting from the process of economic growth. But also in the same figure, you see something, uh, you know, much more challenging to shared prosperity. From around 1980 onwards, inequality is skyrocketing. But even more worryingly, both for men and women, you see the low education and middle education groups actually losing ground. Their real wages are declining. For example, if you look at the green curve on the left, high school educated American workers, men, are experiencing about 0.5% decline in their real earning from the 1980s onwards for the next 3 decades. That's a really striking pattern of non-shared prosperity. This is not just a US phenomenon. The fact that US has low minimum wages, very low unionization, and norms have changed to allow for much higher levels of inequality in communities and within companies has been important for why low wage workers have fared so badly in the United States. But if you look across the OECD countries, other industrialized nations, you'll see two things that are generally quite similar to the United States. Inequality has increased, and workers at the bottom haven't done so well. So it is then important to reconsider why is it that the US was able to achieve something resembling shared prosperity in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. In fact, it turns out the roots of that go back to the second half of the 19th century in both the US and the UK, and you can see them even more clearly in the first half of the 20th century. And then why this model of shared prosperity broke down and how that is very important for us to think in the context of the future of AI. So going back to the two aspects that I highlighted already, you see them taking shape in very clear form in the United States in the early 20th century, especially in the automobile industry. So I'm trying to illustrate that with two pictures. One on the top is from the new Ford Motor Factory, or some of the new motor factories in 1919. Ford was a pioneer in the use of reorganizing factories, introducing early forms of the assembly line, new electrical machinery that automated very important parts of the production process. But you can also see that along the production process, you have many workers that are engaged in very crucial tasks, because what also was a source of productivity growth for Ford Motor Company factories was the creation of new tasks for workers to positively engage in the in work. So it was these human tasks that were both important for the improvements in the mass production of cars and also at the root of the wage growth in the US economy. Tellingly, during this time period, even though the auto industry was at the forefront of introducing new electrical machinery, employment increased tenfold in the car industry. But it was also not just the market process and technology, it was also an institutional process. The auto industry was also at the forefront of worker organization. So on the right, for example, you see the United Auto Workers strike, the sit-down strike in 1937, which was against GM, but similar actions were taken against other automakers. So the two pillars of the productivity bandwagon, that you created new tasks that were making workers central to the production process, and that workers had a voice and had an ability to actually negotiate terms that were favorable and that enabled them to share the prosperity, were already visible very clearly in the first half of the 20th century. And the same processes continued in the 50s and 60s and 70s and became the basis of shared prosperity, as I indicated. So why did things go wrong in the digital age? It is very much related to the breakdown of these two pillars that I have highlighted. Digital technologies have been truly transformative in some respects. Robots know more than many others, perhaps. But companies, when they introduced robots, especially in the US, did not do what Ford did. They did not also create new tasks. So here is a modern car factory, you see the more advanced robotics, but you don't see the workers doing new tasks, inspection, maintenance, skilled crafts work that was so important for the early auto industry. There's just one chap there, but he doesn't seem to be that important. Perhaps he may be engaged in maintenance or design, but the labor to capital ratio is much lower. And that meant that labor demand did not grow, and without labor demand growth, wages did not grow very much. In fact, this is not just an interpretation of history. A lot of the work that I have done highlights the central role that automation plays in the rise in inequality. And this one chart, which I'll explain now, is indicative of the general processes that I emphasize in the book and in this talk. So here, rather than the 10 demographic groups that I showed you in the previous chart, I'm looking at more more detailed, disaggregated demographic groups, so distinguished by education, gender, age, and ethnicity. Each one color-coded shows you the different education-related demographic groups. The big ones are, white, middle-aged men and women. And on the vertical axis now, I am looking at the cumulative change in wages from 1980 to 2016, 2017, which is the critical period of the increase in inequality that you saw earlier on. You'll also see in the graph the zero on the vertical axis, and it will be quite striking to see that so many big demographic groups are below the zero line, meaning that they are the ones that are experiencing negative growth in their real earnings, as that first chart also indicated. But most importantly, what I am doing is on the horizontal axis, I am plotting an estimate of what fraction of the tasks that a demographic group used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated using robots, using other advanced equipment, and using software systems. And what you see is a very strong relationship that accounts for about 60 to 70% of the overall increase in inequality in the United States, and accounts for a large part of why some demographic groups have actually lost ground. They have been at the crosshairs of automation. And this is very much automation without compensating new tasks and new work for these groups, which meant either they've left the labor force, or in many cases they moved to lower quality jobs with lower earnings. But again, as in the British Industrial Revolution, technology is not separable from institutions. And all of this was very much embedded in a change in the balance of power. One part of it was unions became weaker and weaker, both because of secular changes in the US economy, but also action against unions that became bolder over time. This is not the only one that needs to be highlighted, but it's a symbolic one that many people emphasize, is Ronald Reagan, as one of his early acts as president, firing the professional air controllers who were striking. And that was viewed as a signal to many other companies to take a harsher line against their in their collective bargaining activities, especially against striking workers. But also the gentleman that David already mentioned, Milton Friedman, famous and brilliant economist, was one of a series of public intellectuals in the 1970s who started articulating the idea that we should favor and encourage companies to look after their shareholders and not worry about the broader stakeholders, including workers. The only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, Milton Friedman wrote and argued, and many business executives, business schools, and management consultants may have taken that very seriously. And you see quite a lot of evidence that firms started trying to reduce labor costs more enthusiastically after these ideas began to take root. One way in which they did that is by limiting wage growth, but another very powerful way was by cutting labor costs by automating work, which relates to this automation pattern. Now, all of this is history. Some of it is recent history. But I will argue that this is the right time to worry about these issues, because we are at the cusp of truly transformative new technologies associated with artificial intelligence. The one that's the flavor of the month right now is generative AI, but I think the general tendency of using data, software, much more powerful chips is going to have a transformative effect, even if not everybody may be completely enthusiastic or hyped about large language models. And it is the right time to worry, because these AI systems are going to have very powerful capabilities to do much greater levels of automation than early digital technologies. But also, there is a very different direction in which these AI technologies could be developed. And we're already seeing the proof of concept of this with generative AI. There are a couple of studies, one looking at GitHub Copilot for as help for programmers, another one by two PhD students at MIT, Shket Noy and Whitney Zhang, that looks at simple writing tasks, another one by Eric Brynjolfsson, Daniel Lee, and Lindsay Raymond that looks at customer service. And in all of these cases, you find that if large language models, even given their current limitations, are using in the right way, they can be helpful to workers. And the way that they are helpful to workers is actually quite interesting. And I'm showing you some graphs from the Noy and Zhang paper, where they look at how the quality and the time of, or this is the quality, this is the time of completion of simple writing tasks changes. And what you see is that there's a shift up of the quality and shift down of the time taken, but a lot of that shift comes from workers who were middle of the pack. So they weren't performing very well, and these workers can get a big boost in terms of improving their performance from these generative AI tools. And in fact, when you think about it, this is quite sensible, because the real power of generative AI is as a tool for retrieving, analyzing, filtering, and then curating information for human decision makers. Essentially, an irony of our current age is that we have abundant information, for example, on the internet, but we have a real scarcity of useful information. If you are an electrician and you're trying to deal with complex problems, good luck finding out how you can deal with this complex, rare problem. Somebody knows the solution to it because other people have encountered similar problems, but how are you going to find it out? Well, generative AI provides a platform uh, for doing that. It can understand the specific context, and on the basis of that context, recognize what you need to find out and provide advice, recommendation, or expert knowledge from other use cases that have accumulated in the past. But, and this is where I want to really put a lot of emphasis, there is nothing automatic about the development of AI in this direction. And if you look at current evidence, while the promise of AI going in this direction is there, this is not the path that the industry is taking. The industry is emphasizing automation, emphasizing artificial general intelligence, emphasizing doubling down of the business models of previous platforms on the basis of digital ads and collecting of personal data. And that's, I think, is a very important problem to identify. It's an economic problem, but it's not just an economic problem. And in the book with Simon, we depart from the basic economic framework, which emphasizes just profit incentives and the institutional checks. We also argue that the visions, the priorities, approaches, imaginations of powerful actors play an important role. And in the tech industry, you see that as a very important tendency, because a lot of the current tech investment, including in generative AI, is shaped by a vision that goes back to this brilliant gentleman, Alan Turing, who first articulated ideas about autonomous machine intelligence, meaning machines that become intelligent, acting in the ways that human capabilities can be replicated or sometimes even surpassed, and autonomously, meaning without human control. And early AI, including some of the luminaries that I'm showing in that picture from the 1950s, were very much in this mold of emphasizing autonomous machine intelligence. And if your vision is one of autonomous machine intelligence, automation is only a very, very small step away from that. And we see the importance of this autonomous machine intelligence view in two very clear ways, but there are others as well. One is the craze about creating artificial general intelligence, super intelligent machines is very much related to this, and the fact that the industry rewards programmers and designers on the basis of reaching human parity is another aspect of it. Now, if this was the only vision, perhaps we would have no choice but put up with it. But actually, from the very early days, there was a very different vision of what machines should be doing, what computers should be doing, represented by MIT engineer mathematician Norbert Wiener and inventors such as JCR Licklider and Douglas Engelbart, which emphasized not autonomous machine intelligence, but what Simon and I call machine usefulness, using machines in the service of people, and in fact, in the case of AI, in the service of minds. This was a very fruitful approach. Not only I think it had better philosophical foundations, which some of these people articulated, but it also led to some of the most important breakthroughs in early computer technology. Many of the things that we take for granted today, hypertext, hyperlinked, menu-driven things, pretty much everything on your cell phone and the computer mouse came out, for example, out of Douglas Engelbart research, some of his students researched at Xerox PARCs and other places. But unfortunately, in the age of AI, this has been overshadowed by a craze to create artificial general intelligence. Now, you might think, well, we could still do well with artificial general intelligence because it's going to create tremendous amount of productivity growth, but the evidence for that is not very good. We are at a paradoxical time in history because we see tremendous new innovations, some of them very impressive, but economic productivity is growing much slower than it did in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And there is a reason for that, I argue, which is that we often underestimate human capabilities and we rush to get humans out of the decision-making loop. And when that happens, we over-automate things and we don't get the productivity benefits and we don't get the wage benefits, the worker benefits either. So the craze to completely automate customer service in every part of the economy is just the tip of the iceberg. But it's not just the economy. AI misused is a real threat to democracy. Democracy requires dissent, democracy requires information, democracy requires decentralized information. But both authoritarian countries and others are using AI tools in ways that are anti-democratic. Here you see the social credit system, where you have to get your good behavior in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party checked before you can get a train ticket. It's just one of the many ways in which AI technologies are being used by authoritarian countries to suppress dissent and bring better control. And on top, you see another aspect of it, which is social media companies doing content moderation, which of course is completely necessary if we're going to have the type of social media platforms that we have right now. But content moderation is also the flip side of control, because you're giving the control over data to very large organizations that then have to decide what you should see, what you should not see, and how that information should be monetized. And the evidence is mounting that both the authoritarian use of AI and the quasi-democratic use of AI in the hands of platforms such as Facebook and Google have been really bad for democracy. There has been polarization in democratic countries, a suppression of demands for democratic rights in places like China and Iran, and the next step of much more powerful AI machines could actually exacerbate the monopoly of information. This diagnosis, if true, suggests that we are at a really transformative point in our technology history and in our history of inequality and democracy. And it's a transformative point not just because there are some impressive technologies at our fingertips, but also because we have completely defining choices about how to use these technologies and in what direction to define them. And Simon and I argue that we can learn from history about how to rise up to the challenge of such transformative times as well. And I think what we learn from history is that you need a three-pillared approach or three-pronged approach. One, you need to change the narrative about what we want from technologies and how to get that. Second, you need to build countervailing powers. And third, you need to articulate policies for redirecting technological change. What's wrong with this picture is that it creates two types of misconceptions. One is that the future of technology is in the hands of powerful tech entrepreneurs, Sam Altman or Elon Musk. And second, that there is a very clear future that we just have to decide who is going to be the best shepherd for us to take us there. What we are arguing instead is that there are many possible futures out of technology, and we need democratic voice and a broader participatory process for deciding what's out there that will be better for human society. And in fact, the argument that I have made is that there is a pro-human, pro-worker, pro-citizen direction of AI based on developing tools and new tasks for workers, recharging the productivity bandwagon, using AI in a more pro-democratic way, but that's not where we are going. So these choices are very important, and we need to really change the narrative about what type of AI we want and how we can get there. We then need to create countervailing powers. The 1950s and 60s had their own versions of very powerful corporations, but they had to contend with civil society action. Ralph Nader was one of the symbols of that in the 50s and the 1960s. They had to contend with regulation, they had to contend with unions, and they had to contend with a broader set of government priorities. And that has been somewhat lost over the last 40 years, where corporations, especially tech companies, have become very powerful and there are no countervailing powers inside. So we have to rebuild those countervailing powers. We have to talk about specific policies, and Simon and I have a long list at the end of our book, which I'm not going to repeat here, but we may return to them in the Q&A session. But the important thing is that we should not think of policies that have to be developed within this broader institutional framework as band-aids to make up for damages that the fast progress of science and AI technology is going to impose. We should really think of it as redirecting technological change, policy in service of trying to find the best path of this promising suite of technologies for humanity. And this is what many other pioneers of the digital computers also thought. As computers giving people the power to the people, that decentralizing more, making workers more enabled and prosperous. This is not what happened, but there were very clear ideas in the as early as the 1960s and the 70s that actually could achieve that. Now, some of you may think this is just all a pie in the sky. There is no capability for the government action and civil society input to redirect technological change. Well, let me end with this slide, which shows what's happened in the energy sector. We have known that fossil fuel emissions are frying the atmosphere as greenhouse gases for at least 50 years. But there's really nothing that we could have done in the 1980s, 90s, short of a massive reduction in industrial production. The only way to combat climate change in an effective way is to develop alternative to fossil fuel technologies. These were not developing by themselves, but you see from the picture that starting from around the late 2000s, there was a tremendous set of improvements in solar technologies, offshore wind, onshore wind, and this was undergirded by large-scale production as well as a whole slew of innovations in these technologies. They came out of a modicum of carbon pricing in a few countries, a growing amount of support from many governments for green innovations in terms of tax credits, in terms of credit, financial support and subsidies. And it came out of civil society action as consumers became more aware of the dangers of uncontrolled fossil fuel emissions and started demanding cleaner products. We are very much in the midst of this energy transformation, but what started and can hopefully continue in the area of energy, I think should be considered in the area of production technologies and communication technologies. Thank you.
This has been an absolutely fascinating articulation and very clear and beautiful articulation of exactly what kinds of challenges lie ahead. And 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 thank you again for over such a short period of time for capturing such a long history, bringing us right now to the present. We have a number of questions here from our audience, and we'll probably mostly go according to when the question came in. So let me start with the question from Charles Silver, and the question is: if wage growth is highly correlated with education, does it make sense to encourage policies to increase the educational opportunities for the population? Would this lead to more shared prosperity and decrease inequality?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Sris, for the kind words and for mediating the discussion. And Charles, that's an excellent question, but no, my answer is no. In fact, what you've just articulated has been the dominant view in economics, that technology will go where it will go. It will increase the return to education because technology is skill biased, and the only thing we can do is send more people to college. It is true that sending people to college has a variety of benefits, and I work at an educational institution. Many people here do. We, of course, need better educational institutions. But we should not think of college as the only pathway, nor the right type of skills are always college skills. And I want to make two very important points in this regard, at least that I view as important. One is that I think for many workers, the important thing is to make them better decision maker, better problem solvers. That does not necessarily mean college education. So I don't think the best way of training electricians is to send them to four-year colleges. The best way of training electricians is to invest much more in their information and training as regards to the specific set of tasks that they're going to perform, and then create the types of tools that I try to indicate that will make them better electricians and have earnings that could be as high as college workers because they're doing a very important task. But we shouldn't think of college as just a panacea against all of the inequality problems. And second, I think there is a deeper issue here, which is that we should also not think that technology will go wherever it will go. It will create demand for a certain set of skills, and the only thing that public policy can do is to respond to them by providing those skills or failing to provide those skills, as the case may be. I think humans are amazing because of their diversity of skills, perspectives, and approaches. Many people are going to excel in manual tasks or in tinkering tasks. Some people are going to excel in analytical tasks. What we want to do is to understand what are the valuable human skills, both normatively and positively, and then make sure that the technological direction, to the extent that's feasible, helps all of that diversity. So we should make sure that we don't ignore people who are so important for our economy and are working with their hands and with their manual skills. And that, again, says college should not be thought of as panacea. A broader training drive should be a much more important focus.
Thanks. And there is room for more questions, so please keep sending them in. The next one's a quasi comment, but we'll see if you want to amplify it, from Eric Zhang. Your work seems to correspond much more closely with the complaints and unrest for the less educated classes, and yet popular modern narratives seem to continually resist or deny the reality that this is actually happening.
Yeah, I completely agree with the first part of your comment, Eric. Yes, very much. My concern is that we haven't created an economy that's that fair or amazing for most college graduates either. Actually, if you look at real wages of people with just a college degree, they're not increasing all that much. People with very specialized degrees, postgraduate degrees, working in software, finance, or management consulting, those are doing very well. But college graduates are not doing all that amazing either. But the people with lower levels of education, working in more practical tasks, manual tasks, things that combine a variety of problem solving with real world interactions, those have not done very well economically. And that, I think, is really a problem of equity. It's a problem of not using our resources well, and it's actually a threat to democracy. Now, for the second part of your comment, Eric, I'm not entirely sure. You may be right that this reality is being denied in some quarters, but at least in in the academic debates now, this is completely well accepted that we have a problem, that low education Americans have fallen behind, and that is at the root of both the inequality problems and the political problems that this country is having. But perhaps it needs to be amplified even more.
Darren, in your talk, you distinguished between technology that displaces workers with technology that gives empowerment to workers. You gave the example of the automotive plant where it was run by robots. When you were talking about displacement, I was reminded from a different perspective, displacement created by immigrants. And your colleagues at MIT, Duflo and Banerjee, have shown that when some of these immigrants come to USA, yes, they may displace some people who eventually get to jobs that are, better jobs. So my question was, as I was listening to you, whether the labor and the workers displaced by robots, isn't it possible that they can be put in uh, jobs and given tasks that will make them better off? And why is that not taking place?
Thank you, Stris. That's a very important question. First of all, I think some amount of labor reallocation is always going to happen. People are going to lose their jobs. In the United States, millions of people lose their jobs every month, and some of them quit their jobs, some of them lose their jobs, and they go and find new jobs. But the plentifulness of jobs is going to be important for that reallocation process. So what you see in, for example, places like Detroit, which introduced very rapid robotization, or places like parts of North Carolina or Raleigh-Durham, where imports from China destroyed a number of leading employers, new jobs, especially new tasks that paid high wages, did not emerge. So that reallocation process didn't work. And I think that is related to the point that you yourself emphasized, which is you need the technologies to be there to empower the workers. Without the technologies for creating the new tasks, creating new high-paid jobs, that process is going to be hampered. In the case of immigrants, the same thing applies. The debate on immigration is not settled yet. There are many different voices and there are conflicting evidence. One part of it is that US gets a lot of very high-skilled immigrants, and those high-skilled immigrants often go and get very important positions in the tech industry, in finance industry, in consulting industry, and they can contribute to growth via that channel. The effects of low-skill immigration are more complex. There are some people who find exactly that even low-skill immigration does not reduce employment for natives, because natives then can go and get other jobs, and that there are some contrasting voices on that. I think it needs to be studied more, but I think the key is, both for immigration and for other types of reallocation, do we have the better types of jobs available for people to move into once they leave what they are doing currently? And that is the crux of the matter, for which how we use AI is going to be very important.
Thank you.
So Kamir Hazabeh is looking for answers. So as a solution to the coming inequality, what do you think about creating a national pool of funds along the lines of Social Security that invests in technology, AI stocks such as NVIDIA, Microsoft, etc.?
Yeah, I don't think that's the solution. First of all, I don't think fiscal redistribution by itself is a feasible or desirable way of creating shared prosperity. You are absolutely right. The government needs more funds, and some of it can come from better investments, but most of it will have to come from higher taxation. So that's a reality we have to understand and agree on. And some of those funds have to be invested in healthcare. Some of those funds should be invested in trying to redirect technological change, as we have done in the energy sector, and some of them should be invested in improving the social safety net. But things like universal basic income or other purely fiscal transfer tools are not going to be enough to creating shared prosperity. There is no track record of any economy really creating the type of economic growth that I pointed out that the US and many other Western nations experienced, for example, in the 50s and the 60s, where real wages for low-income workers and real incomes for real workers, low-wage workers, were growing about 3% a year. That means that essentially a doubling of your income per capita in about 20 years. So you start as a worker at around 25, go and work in a factory or some other workplace. When you're 45, you're earning twice as much. That type of economic growth, which was the heart of many industrialized nations' economy, that you're not going to be able to create with just pure fiscal redistribution. And that's why I think redirecting technological change in the path to generating better jobs, higher paid jobs, good jobs is very important.
Going to another question from Eric. And I'm going to paraphrase this, Eric, and make it a little shorter from the complete question. How do we make sure that we don't get into a fatalist paradigm? How do we make sure that instead of letting technology take its own path, how do we make sure that we are able to control it in some sense?
Well, I think that's very, very important, and part of the reason why I also object to things like UBI is because it is fatalist. It says we have no chance of reining in technology. It's going to destroy jobs. 60-70% of the population is not going to have the ability to be gainfully employed or earn a decent living. So therefore, we have to create like the modern version of bread and circuses. I find that fatalistic. And I think the only fighting chance that we have against fatalism is a set of coherent policies for redirecting technology. And that's what Simon and I propose at the end of the book. Some of them are about taxes, getting rid of existing distortions in the tax system that excessively encourage automation. That's like, think of that as the equivalent of a carbon tax in the energy case. Some of them are about creating new markets for this new economy, such as data markets, so that tech companies cannot expropriate people's data and also in the process actually damage their own potential of doing better innovation because they don't have access to higher quality data. Some of that is about the key step that I showed in the last slide, redirecting technological change in a more pro-human direction, which is what many governments around the world, from US to Germany to China, have done in the context of subsidizing green innovations such as renewables. Some of it is about organizational changes, which are actually interestingly taking place. For example, bringing worker voice about how AI should be used, which is what we saw in the Writers Guild of America. Some of it is more about democracy and communication. We have to find the right regulatory framework for dealing with platforms and misinformation and online polarization. There have been many different approaches on this. None of it is perfect. China is a very heavy-handed regulation towards these platforms, which is quite non-democratic, but it's been effective in some ways. And I think we have to think about what are the democratic equivalents of those regulations. So, for instance, in the book, we propose digital ad taxes, which would be light-handed but quite effective in changing the incentives of platforms.
The destruction of the manufacturing jobs, post 1980, and the automation you referred to, the change in the demand curve. How much of a role did moving manufacturing, overseas, have a role as well?
I think it did have a role. So, international trade or globalization really has three legs, and all of them have been important, but my research suggests automation has been more important than all three of them combined. One is that globalization has enabled a lot of capital mobility, some of it in the form of tax havens and tax competition, which reduced the ability of domestic governments to tax capital. I think that's been an important trend. Some of it has been in the form of cheap imports from China, especially, flooding certain sectors, and work by my colleagues David Otter, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson, for example, has shown, some of my work has shown that has had a bad effect on the employment in a number of areas and sectors. But the one that's, I think, most similar to automation is offshoring, which is what you were referring to, David. That different from the final goods that are imported, the parts of the production process are done in Mexico, in Vietnam, in China, in Taiwan, and that has similar effects to automation. It's also been important. Our work finds that it has had very similar effects to automation, but quantitatively smaller.
Interesting.
Here's a question from Silvina Siriani. Would an education more focused on fostering human creativity help counteract the displacement caused by automation tech? Human genius cannot be replaced, and maybe current education is only tapping a minimum of its possibilities. That's the question.
100%, Silvina. I completely agree that what's distinctive about human decision making, human judgment, are not going to be easy for even the most advanced large language models to replicate anytime soon. And that is a human comparative advantage, and we should cultivate it. And this is based both on experience, how we actually enable people to learn on the job. It's about the education system. But I again hasten to add, it's not the only thing, because when we just emphasize creativity, that often takes the form of, analytical creativity, people who, go to college and, get a liberal arts education or something like that. I think that's very important. That's going to be one of the areas in which humans are going to have a comparative advantage against machines. But there is also manual work that's very important. There's also social work. There is empathy work. And all of those things, I think, are going to become more important in the early decades of the 21st century. And we have to cultivate them. We have to provide skills. We have to provide training. We have to provide tools.
So how about one? We'll squeeze in one more as our hour's just about up. Lyric Hale, a very intriguing statement about the link between technology and institutions. But does that mean technology will always be centralized?
No, I don't believe so. But that's just a belief. So there are two reasons why people argue technology will be centralized. One is technical. The other one is political. I think the technical one is definitely not right. There is nothing in the logic of the internet, social media, AI that says it should lead to monopolization of information. So the people in the early 2000s, late 1990s who thought that social media was going to be a democratizing platform, they weren't completely delusional. They turned out to be wrong, but they turned out to be wrong because China, Iran, Russia, and the US governments poured much more money into controlling the internet and controlling communications than the private sector was willing to do for the decentralization. So the question is there a political channel that will always steer these technologies towards greater monopolization? And even then, I don't think so. After all, other historically important innovations, such as the printing press and radio, were at times used for centralization, but then became tools that were used in much more decentralized ways and sometimes very pro-democratic ways. So I think there are opportunities for us to use them in many different pathways. Taiwan has a great track record, for example, under the leadership of Audrey Tang, in using digital tools for building new platforms for citizen participation, democratic deliberations. better regulation or better monitoring by citizens of what the government is doing. So there are many pathways ahead of us.
Well, I think we have come up with the hour. So thanks again, Darren. Thank you very much. Thank you, David. And thanks to our audience. This was the last event for this semester and this calendar year. And we will have a very exciting lineup again starting in spring. So please stay tuned, and please join us in our webinars. And one more time, thanks again, Darren, for leaving with us all of these very thoughtful and thought-provoking questions and issues.
Thank you very much, Srish. Thank you very much, David and Lerzan, for inviting me and for hosting me here.
Awesome. Thank you.